Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're listening. This has been an interesting week. Had a couple of responses following up on Ian McGilchrist, and I'll come to that in a moment. I think for some people he's clearly touching a nerve, and that's important. The culture we live in is in trouble, and people know that, and yet don't want to do a great deal of work to think about why. And this week I had a very interesting time of getting to know one of the members of the congregation of the church I go to. He had heard me give a short talk and made some comments, and we ended up having lunch together. Now, he'd spent his life in a very practical area from his point of view, but he was working with trying to get projects working in the poor two-thirds of the world and finding that it wasn't easy. It didn't work that well. We discovered that we had some reading in common, and then he brought up this book, Culture Matters, which dates back to about 2000. Samuel P Huntington caused a bit of a stir around then by making rather serious claims that the reductive approach of the social scientists and the politicians towards the problems of the developing world was not going to work, and was in fact not working. And they were looking at some successes that had happened, but they'd happened in spite of rather than because of the policies of our world. I realized the book was on my shelf, so when I got home I pulled it out, and I remember as soon as I opened it up that the first line had stuck in my memory. I'd forgotten where I'd heard it. But here it is. In the early 1990s, I happened to come across economic data on Ghana and South Korea in the early 60s, and I was astonished to see how similar their economies were. These two countries had roughly comparable levels of per capita GNP, similar divisions of their economy among primary products, manufacturing and services, and overwhelmingly primary product exports, with South Korea producing a few manufactured goods. Also, they were both receiving comparable levels of economic aid. 30 years later, South Korea had become an industrial giant with the 14th largest economy in the world, multinational corporations, major exports of automobiles, electronic equipment and other sophisticated manufactures, and a per capita income approximating that of Greece. Moreover, it was on its way to the consolidation of democratic institutions. No such changes had occurred in Ghana, whose per capita GNP was now about 1/15 of that of South Korea. How could this extraordinary difference in development be explained? Undoubtedly, many factors played a role, but it seemed to me that culture had to be a large part of the explanation. South Koreans valued thrift, investment, hard work, education, organization, and discipline. Ghanaians had different values. In short, cultures count. This led to quite a lot of stuff, and this book is actually a series of essays by people with very different views, including some of those who have been responsible for saying they've put money into the situation and get some projects going and all will be well. And of course, it hasn't been well. It hasn't worked. And countries that were important and well organized and productive, like South Africa, are going down the tubes. Some countries have succeeded. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, although Hong Kong is now disappearing and going backwards for obvious reasons. What have the others got in common? They all had serious wartime mishandling. Singapore by China, Taiwan by Japan, Korea by Japan. The economies that bounced back from destruction after the Second World War, Germany, Japan, and slowly the European ones, and China. But the others, despite large amounts of money, have not improved significantly. Now, as I read through the titles and the people writing, it suddenly struck me something that it hadn't struck me in 2000. I wasn't anywhere near thinking about it in this way then. First of all, that was the same time at which a book I've referred to many times was published. Robert Fogle's The Fourth Great Awakening, University of Chicago economist, bothered that the future of America was not secure in his view. But he put it firmly in the area of culture as well, but more specifically in the area of trust. What are the trust mechanisms in various environments, and what difference does that make? And the answer is huge, of course, as we know, but we're still a long way from being concerned about it. The other thing that was interesting, apart from the reductive approach of the conference that Harrison and Huntington were at, was the total absence of any discussion of Darwin, which is extraordinary. I also had not thought about this at all in 2000, but it was shortly after that I came across David Stove, introduced by Graham Hunter, and his book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, shook me up to a considerable degree. It's quite clear why the people trying to do good things with respect to other countries don't want to talk about Darwin. And yet at the same time, they talk about things evolving, and Darwin is lurking in the background all the while. But the problem is that Darwin's idea is that evolution occurs because of minor benefits to individuals, who then, because they've got a benefit, grow. That's his thesis. But it has a real drawback from the point of view of what we're talking about at the moment, in that there's no way you can get morality out of a Darwinian view of the world. And Stove was the person who made that abundantly clear, much to the chagrin of most of the Darwinians who refused to engage with him. Now, he was an atheist, but a rigorous philosopher who knew when something was not proved and knew when something was rubbish. And so in Darwinian Fairy Tales, he simply said you can't get a moral structure out of a Darwinian approach to the world. But we do have a moral structure, so it's not adequate. We're not good at that. When we see something that really doesn't fit, we don't like going back to the drawing boards. In fact, as one great scientist said, when you attack what has been a standard paradigm for understanding, don't expect to succeed until the authors of it are dead. We hold on to our ideas, even as scientists, perhaps particularly as scientists and academics, in spite of the evidence, for a long while, centuries in some cases. When the evidence that we're wrong is clearly apparent, it still takes us a long while to accept it, when we've got a system that works for us in terms of the world around us. We're not very honest. So it's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it, that when Christ begins his ministry, the first thing he says we need, if we're going to grow by becoming his disciples, is we've got to learn to practice internal honesty. I call it the bubble over the head test, and everybody fails. The bubble in the head test is simply to imagine that you're a cartoon character for a week and all your thoughts are on display in the bubble over your head. Is there anybody who could survive that week with their marriage intact, with their family intact, with their friends intact, with their job intact, with anything intact? Probably not, unless they were at the top and they had the power. That's where we've got to. We've taken some Darwinian aspects, like making politics all about power and privilege, and neglecting the deeper issues of truth. Real truth does exist, and it exists in both the physical world. You do an experiment, you get a result. Somebody does the same experiment in another part of the world, they get the same result. Somebody else does it, gets the same result. You can repeat it regularly. That's established facts. But what these people did who were getting together to talk about development was not to look at the established facts, to neglect any discussion of the cultures that worked, to see what we can learn, not to look for data that went against their hypothesis because they all had jobs on the line. They were all getting well paid as advisors to governments all over the place when they knew perfectly well they didn't have an answer to what's going on. So, talking to Bill this week, he'd been involved in that area. But as an honest man, a regular churchgoer, claims to have no personal sense of Christ in his life, but knows something about the importance of having that kind of background in your life. What's going on here? Well, it's as always, come back to it all a while. In Deuteronomy 5, where Moses says to the children of Israel, God heard that you said you would obey. He also knows you won't. He says, if you did obey and keep these arbitrary rules, then it would go well with you and your children and your society forever. It has done. And how the rest of the world hates it. I mean, what's going on at the moment with Israel? Can you imagine any other country in the world that received several hundred missiles, drones and the like in one night and was then pressured by the rest of the world not to respond because they were colonialists? As somebody put it the other day rather nicely, a large part of America used to belong to Mexico. If Mexico decided with the help of oil money from Venezuela to bombard the U.S., would they be there the next morning? Would the U.S. care to discuss whether they had the right to defend their territory, which is theirs by dint of possession for a certain amount of time with the consent of the people who are there? Of course they wouldn't. Only Israel is expected to play by different rules. Now, this is not a question of politics from my point of view. It's a question of why different rules. I want to know why the rest of the world wants different rules. Why do you draw arbitrary lines and not look back and say, hey, that won't work? After all, the Jews were in what the Palestinians want to take for 1,000 years, on and off, before the Muslims came along. Why does that period of time count less than the results of the takeover by power, by military means in the 7th century, by Islam, 7th century AD? They're both the same situation. Possession is 9/10 of the law in politics, always has been, and people just recognize that. You get on and deal with it. But we're not doing that. We've lost some basic structure to our world. Truth is not honoured in the way that it used to be. I'm, at this stage of my life, very grateful for the fact that my mother imprinted on my backside when I was just about capable of understanding what was going on, a very high commitment to truth-telling. I understood in this family, lying is the worst sin. So it's better to own up, because the punishment for owning up will be a lot less than the punishment for lying. That's a great thing to teach a child. Always when you have a child in your family who's misbehaved, if they admit it, first celebrate their honesty and then negotiate the response. They will cooperate with both, because deep down we need it. So the first requirement that we've lost is truth-telling, not only about the factual area that the media go after, the so-called permanent science, which of course is not permanent, it's provisional, a paradigm can shift, and what we thought we knew, the facts remain, but the understanding of those facts changes dramatically. So physical facts they remain, but how we understand them, the model we use, that's up for grabs all the while. But in the moral world, it's the other way around. We try to change the physical facts. Well, the physical facts have changed. The vast majority of Americans are not having heterosexual marriage as a permanent basis of their life anymore. That used to be what it was. America developed without any development programs. So did Britain. So did Europe. But it did have the infrastructure with which to do it. And one of the things that does turn up in those essays is the acknowledgement that far and away Protestant-based cultures have managed to keep corruption down to minimal levels for the longest. The Catholics give in a bit earlier. But when you go down the list, I mean, you get to the Marxists, there's no such thing as the world of truth. When you get rid of metaphysical truth, Lenin wrote, when we've got rid of God, it will be necessary to legalize terror. That happens around the world. I've read several times in the last few weeks that Muslims agreeing with that if the Quran could be expunged of all instructions to Muslims to kill members of the Muslim faith who depart, who change their belief system, if that concept was removed and people were free to leave if they felt like it, then millions, they say, would leave Islam overnight. Many people go to the mosque to keep their membership of the community, and they're good at that, intact. They don't want to break it down. But the price, especially for some women, is very high. The pressures are mounting. I don't know what's going to happen. Those who live longer than I'm likely to are going to live through very interesting times. So lunch over last week with Bill was very interesting, and I'm no doubt we will continue to move in that direction. He trained in science, in maths and physics at the University of Toronto, very competent guy. But he said, I've always thought of myself in very practical terms. I don't have any mystical experiences or anything like this. Here's a sentence I want to read to you about that. Leaving nuance aside and condensing 3 decades of research and a vast body of supporting evidence into a phrase, we, that is the whole world, are now mesmerized by the least intelligent part of the human brain. For reasons of survival, one hemisphere of the brain, the left, has evolved over millions of years to favor manipulation, grabbing, getting, and controlling, while the other, the right, has been tasked with the understanding of the whole picture. So conflicting are these goals that in humans the hemispheres are largely sequestered from one another. Our seeming ability these days to hear only what comes from the left hemisphere does not arise from the brains having changed radically in the last couple of centuries, though it is indeed always evolving. It's more like this. You buy a radio set, and you soon find a couple of channels worth listening to. After a while, you find yourself listening to only one. It's not the radio set that has changed, it's you. In the case of the brain, it would not matter so much if we had settled on the intelligent channel. But we didn't. We settled on the one whose value has nothing to do with truth, or courage, or magnanimity, or generosity, but only with greed, grabbing, and getting, manipulation. That, of course, is Ian McGilchrist, and it's in the March edition of First Things. If you don't know this journal and you like to think, this will help you. You take a year's subscription out, you get 10 issues. You won't read the whole thing to begin with if you're an ordinarily educated university graduate. Read from the back page forwards, leaving out the last article. But then there's a section just penultimate to the back that is called While We're At It. It's the nonsense going on in the world. Then read some of the short articles or anything that intrigues you. Look at the book reviews and read Reno's editorial. If you do that, by the end of a year, people who previously thought they could beat you in discussion and debate will think twice before they engage, because they'll teach you to think better. That's what they do. And you get a range of opinions, literally from atheists to Christians, Jews, and Muslims have all written in that journal. And that's a huge contribution to Western culture. Anybody who's in the legal profession, for instance, if they're at the level of policy in the legal profession, they have to read the annual review in First Things of the behavior of the Supreme Court. It makes them think. They don't like it, but they know they have to think about it. So that the biggest problem that has happened in our world, in my view, has been the reduction of moral truth from first place to very low down. The first truth that appears in our hierarchy of values is factual truth, usually in scientific and technical terms. That's the getting and grabbing and manipulating truth. Now, the two hemispheres cooperate to a degree, but below the level of consciousness. So the great insights that McGilchrist got were from looking at stroke and finding out how different are the effects on the human personality of a right brain stroke and a left brain stroke. The one to really fear is the right brain stroke, because you're going to have more anger and less understanding afterwards. That's the problem, and unless recovery is complete. Thinking about the hierarchy of goods, our world puts DEI, I prefer DIE because that's what it will do. Diversity, inclusion, and equity, meaning equity of outcome, will destroy all drive, all desire, all effort to make anything and do anything, because at the end of the day, the products will be evenly distributed anyway. If you make everything equal, you must dumb down because you can't dumb upwards. And that's what's happening. Now, if you put truth first, it's entirely different. And we need to recognize just how important that is. The only way I know of getting under the skin of parents in particular is to tell one or two short stories. But if I'm talking to parents about education at the university level, they all want it to be relevant and to end up with a job. To which my response is, you'd be better off going to community college to get the bits of paper to be accredited in areas where you can't be made unemployed, like being an electrician, a plumber, a carpenter. Anybody who has a real skill that takes time to acquire is going to be increasingly valuable because they'll be diminishing in number. Knowing which buttons to push on a computer is not really a skill. Knowing how to manipulate TikTok and social media is a skill, but it's dubious whether it's any value to the society as a whole. I think not before grade 8 is a very good motto to take towards screens. No unsupervised screen time before grade 8 would be a very good idea. If they want friends, they should invite them round. They should have to interact with them face to face, not on a screen. So my example, which I've done on this podcast before, but it's so effective that I will do it again. I take Dr. Johnson's advice: men need not so much to be taught as to be reminded. And it's the story of Michael Faraday, born to a blacksmith, poor, but very deeply involved in the church. No education beyond the first level, working as an apprentice bookbinder in London in the early 18th century, with no future other than being a bookbinder. But fortunately, there were free public lectures by real scientists, and the ones at the Royal Institute always included experiments. And he went along, loved them, took good notes, particularly one lecture, which has turned up in the last 2 or 3 years on YouTube on the Royal Institute's website, and it's well worth watching. The day in which Michael Faraday invented the electric motor in 24 hours, in less than 24 hours, and then gave a lecture about it. And that was something Michael Faraday did himself because he'd been involved by the experiments, obsessed by them, and applied for the job as technician, and eventually became president of the Royal Institute without ever going to university. And it was when he was president that he invented the electric motor. And it's a lovely account. They laughed at Mr. Faraday's fields, upon which every phone depends. But in our world, he would never have got to that position because we've closed down those ranks. We've got into an accreditation racket. Soon you'll have to take a course to blow your nose. This is ridiculous. And when we do it, our own egos get in the way, or our own hurts. So DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity, are driven by anger and resentment, justified resentment at some level, And the conclusion is not built around what will be an outcome that will make it better. The appointment of Claudine Gay on those criteria as the first black president of Harvard was an insult to black people. There were plenty of black people who could have been appointed, who did have the skills and had done the training, had earned their spurs, but they were passed over in favor of the criteria which we have now. Most heresy, Lewis says somewhere, is good things in wrong places. Diversity, inclusion, and equality of access, equality of treatment, not equality of outcome. You can't do that. It's not a human possibility. Are good ideas, but they must be under the more important ideas, like truth. If you want to be really happy, here's a list of things you might think of doing. First, start with being as authentic as you can, particularly about your own struggles. In other words, being truthful about how difficult life is. Everybody's in the same state. When we become honest in that way, you immediately have fellowship and community. That also means that you need forgiveness and they need forgiveness. So you become a forgiving society, because that's what we should do. What we have received, we must give. What's happening at the moment with the cancelling of incredibly good people and the fact there's absolutely no redemption for the dead white male like me, as though the amount of pigment in my skin was more important than anything else. That's utter and complete nonsense, and it will destroy everybody. So once you have received forgiveness and you realize where it came from, your life must now begin to be built around obedience to what is good and true and beautiful. And they do make demands on you. We want it to come easy. We don't ask, what do I need to really understand these things? We ask, how do I feel about it? And the result is that students at university today have not read great literature. They're not sophisticated in the history of music. They know very little about art, and when they see something really moving, as in church this Sunday, the pastor, the rector, put up on the screen Caravaggio's picture of Thomas being invited by Christ to look at the wounds and put his hand in his side. And given the context with the sermon, they won't forget that picture. Whereas the standard sort of pretty picture you've seen, particularly evangelical homes, rather dominant in pink and purple and pseudo attempts at light, are not in the same league. When a picture can stop you in your tracks, or a sculpture, you know that you've met something different. When music can do it. When I was a student, I was able to go to St. Matthew Passion twice every Easter, once in the festival hall and once in a church. For me, it was deeply moving in a way that I think most people, well, my friend this week said, I don't have that aspect of life. And what McGilchrist is saying is you need education in that area. You've got to go for it in the sense of hard work. You read some things because people tell you they're really worth reading. You go and look at some pictures. You go and listen to some music for the same reason. There's a lovely account of two Americans coming out of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and one saying to the other, well, I didn't think much of those pictures. And the porter at the door interjected, sir, it's not the pictures that are under examination. When generations of people can report that story, that book, that picture, that music has dominated my life in many ways, in good ways, it's not for you to say they mean nothing to me, therefore they are no meaning. You are not the arbiter. And we have settled for lower things. And my friend said, I acknowledge immediately that I have missed out on the area that needs to be understood. we train our minds in that direction. I quoted last week Pride and Prejudice. Darcy saying to Elizabeth, "You must have thought me devoid of all proper sentiment." We are meant to be trained. Back to Deuteronomy, the Jewish children from that time onwards were trained by hearing the history contained, the stories contained in the Bible, and realizing slowly how important they were. When a child sees an adult cry over some book or event, art, and they at that point feel nothing, but they do know, what's this about? This is a world I know nothing about. We are supposed to be modeling for our children what matters. Now, I don't cry easily. I've seen too much tragedy, dealt with too many awful situations. But I always cry when grace suddenly interrupts a life in front of me. I find those moments where you see someone or you yourself experience the presence of the realities beyond our immediate reductive world, I find that utterly impossible not to respond to emotionally. And the world is better for those things. We need it. I hope this has been some stimulus to you, even perhaps a little unsettling. We all need to be unsettled. You will in due course look at your own history in the Western world. We are utterly dependent on our Judeo-Christian background for all the things we value. They can all be traced back to that, with the logical element brought into it by the Greeks. A great asset. Go in peace.